The American Yawp. Chapter 8. The Early Republic. Section 4. Jefferson as President, buttressed by robust public support. Jefferson sought to implement policies that reflected his own political ideology. He worked to reduce taxes and cut the government's budget, believing that this would expand the economic opportunities of free Americans. His cuts included national defense, and Jefferson restricted the regular army to 3,000 men. England may have needed taxes and debt to support its military empire, but Jefferson was determined to live in peace, and that belief led him to reduce America's national debt while getting rid of all internal taxes during his first term. In a move that became the crowning achievement of his presidency, Jefferson authorized the acquisition of Louisiana from France in 1803 in what is considered the largest real estate deal in American history. France had ceded Louisiana to Spain in exchange for West Florida after the 7 Years' War decades earlier. Jefferson was concerned about American access to New Orleans, which served as an important port for Western farmers. His worries multiplied when the French secretly reacquired Louisiana in 1800. Spain remained in Louisiana for 2 more years, while the U.S. Minister to France, Robert R. Livingston, tried to strike a compromise. Fortunately for the United States, the pressures of war in Europe and the slave insurrection in Haiti forced Napoleon to rethink his vast North American holdings. Rebellious enslaved people, coupled with a yellow fever outbreak in Haiti, defeated French forces, stripping Napoleon of his ability to control Haiti, the home of profitable sugar plantations. Deciding to cut his losses, Napoleon offered to sell the entire Louisiana territory for $15 million, roughly equivalent to $250 million today. Negotiations between Livingston and Napoleon's foreign minister, Talleyrand, succeeded more spectacularly than either Jefferson or Livingston could have imagined. Jefferson made an inquiry to his cabinet regarding the constitutionality of the Louisiana Purchase, but he believed he was obliged to operate outside the strict limitations of the Constitution if the good of the nation was at stake, as his ultimate responsibility was to the American people. Jefferson felt he should be able to, quote, throw himself on the justice of his country when he facilitated the interests of the very people he served. The Louisiana Purchase was the greatest foreign policy success of Jefferson's presidency, but it also renewed Federalist fears that some sizable portion of the approximately 828,000 square miles acquired from France could eventually become more slave states, resulting in more slave representation, thus ensuring the domination of the slave South and the Republican Party in perpetuity. In June 1804, a Federalist in the Massachusetts House of Representatives named William Ely proposed an amendment to the Constitution to get rid of the 3/5 clause. The amendment, if adopted, would base representation on the number of each state's free inhabitants only. The terms for including enslaved people in the apportionment of House seats and Electoral College votes were so manifestly unequal at the time the Constitution was formed, Ely's motion went on, that they could have resulted only from the spirit of conciliation and compromise which influenced the eastern states. But Jefferson's actions as president, including the Louisiana Purchase, had made an unjust situation worse. Louisiana was an extensive country which will require a great number of slaves for its cultivation, and when admitted into the Union, agreeably to the cession, will contribute, by the number of its slaves, to destroy the real influence of the eastern states in the national government, and also in the alteration of the original mode of electing the President of the United States, whereby, in the appointment of that important magistrate, the weight of the small states, among which are most of the eastern states, where there are few or no slaves, is greatly diminished. Ely's amendment contained none of the bombast of Federalist attacks on Republicans or the personhood of the enslaved, but it reflected the same basic logic. The essential problem with the Constitution was that it treated enslaved people for the purpose of political representation as persons at all. To correct the injustice, the Constitution had to be amended to treat enslaved people no differently than any other type of property. While some attacks on slave representation did foreground that slavery was evil and the sale of man was criminal, Federalist defenders of Ely's amendment more often doubled down on their denial of enslaved humanity. Now the slaves of the southern states were no more civil beings, had no more political capacities, were no more persons than our oxen or horses, one ally of Ely's amendment declared in September 1804. All their earnings belonged to their masters. They passed by bills of sale like our cattle, and certainly were, in the estimation of their masters, as little entitled to representation as our beasts of burden. Another piece agreed. The slave, like the ox, is so much property, a mere marketable article. He gives his owner a certain influence in elections, declared this piece, published in a New Hampshire newspaper. The piece continued. Append this influence to all property, and we are content. We ask nothing but that the New England cattle should be represented as well as those of Virginia. The argument that enslaved people should not be represented because they were not persons was as absurd by early 19th century standards as it is today, and Ely's amendment failed to gain much real traction. Jefferson won re-election in a landslide that fall, and Ely's amendment eventually died on the Senate floor in December. Jefferson's foreign policy, particularly the Embargo Act of 1807, would prove more politically damaging. As Napoleon Bonaparte's armies moved across Europe, Jefferson wrote to a European friend that he was glad that God had divided the dry lands of your hemisphere from the dry lands of ours, and said, "Here at least be there peace." Unfortunately, the Atlantic Ocean soon became the site of Jefferson's greatest foreign policy test, as England, France, and Spain refused to respect American ships' neutrality. The greatest offenses came from the British, who resumed the policy of impressment, seizing thousands of American sailors and forcing them to fight for the British Navy. Many Americans called for war when the British attacked the USS Chesapeake in 1807. The president, however, decided on a policy of peaceable coercion, and Congress agreed. Under the Embargo Act of 1807, American ports were closed to all foreign trade, in hopes of avoiding war. Jefferson hoped that an embargo would force European nations to respect American neutrality. Historians disagree over the wisdom of peaceable coercion. At first, withholding commerce rather than declaring war appeared to be the ultimate means of nonviolent conflict resolution. In practice, the embargo hurt the U.S. economy. Even Jefferson's personal finances suffered. When Americans resorted to smuggling their goods out of the country, Jefferson expanded governmental powers to try to enforce their compliance, leading some to label him a tyrant. Criticism of Jefferson's policies reflected the same rhetoric his supporters had used earlier against Adams and the Federalists. Federalists attacked the American Philosophical Society and the study of natural history, believing both to be too saturated with Democratic Republicans. Some Federalists lamented the alleged decline of educational standards for children. Moreover, James Callender published accusations that were later proven credible by DNA evidence that Jefferson was involved in a sexual relationship with Sally Hemings, one of his enslaved laborers. Callender referred to a hypothetical son of Jefferson's as "our little mulatto president," joining previous Federalist attacks on Jefferson's racial politics, including a scathing pamphlet written by South Carolinian William Lawton Smith in 1796 that described the principles of Jeffersonian democracy as the beginning of a slippery slope to dangerous racial equality. Arguments lamenting the democratization of America were far less effective than those that borrowed from democratic language and alleged that Jefferson's actions undermined the sovereignty of the people. When Federalists attacked Jefferson, they often accused him of acting against the interests of the very public he claimed to serve. This tactic represented a pivotal development. As the Federalists scrambled to stay politically relevant, it became apparent that their ideology, rooted in 18th century notions of virtue, paternalistic rule by wealthy elite, and the deference of ordinary citizens to an aristocracy of merit, was no longer tenable. The Federalists' adoption of Republican political rhetoric signaled a new political landscape in which both parties embraced the direct involvement of the citizenry. The Democratic-Republican Party rose to power on the promise to expand voting and promote a more direct link between political leaders and the electorate. The American populace continued to demand more direct access to political power. Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe sought to expand voting through policies that made it easier for Americans to purchase land. Under their leadership, 7 new states entered the Union. By 1824, only 3 states still had rules about how much property someone had to own before he could vote. Never again would the Federalists regain dominance over either Congress or the presidency. The last Federalist to run for president, Rufus King, lost to Monroe in 1816. Section 5. Native American Power and the United States. The Jeffersonian rhetoric of equality contrasted harshly with the reality of a nation stratified along the lines of gender, class, race, and ethnicity. Diplomatic relations between Native Americans and local, state, and national governments offer a dramatic example of the dangers of those inequalities. Prior to the Revolution, many Native American nations had balanced a delicate diplomacy between European empires, which scholars have called the playoff system. Moreover, in many parts of North America, indigenous peoples dominated social relations. Americans pushed for more land in all their interactions with native diplomats and leaders, but boundaries were only one source of tension. Trade, criminal jurisdiction, roads, the sale of liquor, and alliances were also key negotiating points. Despite their role in fighting on both sides, Native American negotiators were not included in the diplomatic negotiations that ended the Revolutionary War. Unsurprisingly, the final document omitted concessions for Native allies. Even as Native peoples proved vital trading partners, scouts, and allies against hostile nations, they were often condemned by white settlers and government officials as, quote, savages. White ridicule of indigenous practices and disregard for indigenous nations' property rights and sovereignty prompted some indigenous peoples to turn away from white practices. In the wake of the American Revolution, Native American diplomats developed relationships with the United States, maintained or ceased relations with the British Empire or with Spain in the South, and negotiated their relationship with other Native nations. Formal diplomatic negotiations included Native rituals to reestablish relationships and open communication. Treaty conferences took place in Native towns, at neutral sites in borderlands, and in state and federal capitals. While chiefs were politically important, skilled orators, such as Red Jacket, as well as intermediaries and interpreters, also played key roles in negotiations. Native American orators were known for metaphorical language, command of an audience, and compelling voice and gestures. Throughout the early republic, diplomacy was preferred to war. Violence and warfare carried enormous costs for all parties, in lives, money, trade disruptions, and reputation. Diplomacy allowed parties to air their grievances, negotiate their relationships, and minimize violence. Violent conflicts arose when diplomacy failed. Native diplomacy testified to the complexity of indigenous cultures and their role in shaping the politics and policy of American communities, states, and the federal government. Yet white attitudes, words, and policies frequently relegated Native peoples to the literal and figurative margins as, quote, ignorant savages. Poor treatment like this inspired hostility and calls for alliances from leaders of distinct Native nations, including the Shawnee leader Tecumseh. Tecumseh and his brother, Tenskwatawa, the prophet, helped envision an alliance of North America's indigenous populations to halt the encroachments of the United States. They created towns in present-day Indiana, first at Greenville, then at Prophetstown, in defiance of the Treaty of Greenville, 1795. Tecumseh traveled to many diverse Native nations from Canada to Georgia, calling for unification, resistance, and the restoration of sacred power. Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa's Confederacy was the culmination of many movements that swept through indigenous North America during the 18th century. An earlier coalition fought in Pontiac's War. Neolin, the Delaware prophet, influenced Pontiac, an Ottawa-Odawa war chief, with his vision of Native independence, cultural renewal, and religious revitalization. Through Neolin, the Master of Life, the Great Spirit, urged Native peoples to shrug off their dependency on European goods and technologies, reassert their faith in Native spirituality and rituals, and cooperate with one another against the white people's ways and nature. Additionally, Neolin advocated violence against British encroachments on Native American lands, which escalated after the 7 Years' War. His message was particularly effective in the Ohio and Upper Susquehanna valleys, where polyglot communities of indigenous refugees and migrants from across eastern North America lived together. When combined with the militant leadership of Pontiac, who took up Neolin's message, the many Native peoples of the region united in attacks against British forts and people. From 1763 until 1765, the Great Lakes, Ohio Valley, and Upper Susquehanna Valley areas were embroiled in a war between Pontiac's Confederacy and the British Empire, a war that ultimately forced the English to restructure how they managed Native-British relations and trade. In the interim between 1765 and 1811, other Native prophets kept Neolin's message alive while encouraging indigenous peoples to resist Euro-American encroachments. These individuals included the Ottawa leader, the Trout, also called Mayagawai, Joseph Brant of the Iroquois Haudenosaunee, the Creek headman Mad Dog, Painted Pole of the Shawnee, a Mohawk woman named Kukuchi, Main-Pock of the Potawatomi, and the Seneca prophet Handsome Lake. Once again, the epicenter of this resistance and revitalization originated in the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes regions, where from 1791 to 1795, a joint force of Shawnee, Delaware, Miami, Iroquois, Ojibwe, Ottawa, Huron, Potawatomi, Mingo, Chickamauga, and other indigenous peoples waged war against the American Republic. Although this Western Confederacy ultimately suffered defeat at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, this Native coalition achieved a number of military victories against the Republic, including the destruction of 2 American armies, forcing President Washington to reformulate federal policy. Tecumseh's experiences as a warrior against the American military in this conflict probably influenced his later efforts to generate solidarity among North American indigenous communities. Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa articulated ideas and beliefs similar to their 18th century predecessors. In particular, Tenskwatawa pronounced that the Master of Life entrusted him, and Tecumseh with the responsibility for returning Native peoples to the one true path, and to rid Native communities of the dangerous and corrupting influences of Euro-American trade and culture. Tenskwatawa stressed the need for cultural and religious renewal, which coincided with his blending of the tenets, traditions, and rituals of indigenous religions and Christianity. In particular, Tenskwatawa emphasized apocalyptic visions that he and his followers would usher in a new world and restore Native power to the continent. For Native peoples who gravitated to the Shawnee Brothers, this emphasis on cultural and religious revitalization was empowering and spiritually liberating, especially given the continuous American assaults on native land and power in the early 19th century. Tecumseh's Confederacy drew heavily from indigenous communities in the Old Northwest and the festering hatred for land-hungry Americans. Tecumseh attracted a wealth of allies in his adamant refusal to concede any more land. Tecumseh proclaimed that the Master of Life tasked him with the responsibility of returning native lands to their rightful owners. In his efforts to promote unity among Native peoples, Tecumseh also offered these communities a distinctly Native American identity that brought disparate Native peoples together under the banner of a common spirituality, together resisting an oppressive force. In short, spirituality tied together the resistance movement. Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa were not above using this unifying rhetoric to legitimate their own authority within indigenous communities at the expense of other Native leaders. This manifested most visibly during Tenskwatawa's witch hunts of the 1800s. Those who opposed Tenskwatawa or sought to accommodate Americans were labeled witches. While Tecumseh attracted Native peoples from around the Northwest, the Red Stick Creeks brought these ideas to the Southeast. Led by the Creek prophet Hillis Hadjo, who accompanied Tecumseh when he toured throughout the Southeast in 1811, the Red Sticks integrated certain religious tenets from the North and invented new religious practices specific to the Creeks, all the while communicating and coordinating with Tecumseh after he left Creek country. In doing so, the Red Sticks joined Tecumseh in his resistance movement while seeking to purge Creek society of its Euro-American dependencies. Creek leaders who maintained relationships with the United States, in contrast, believed that accommodation and diplomacy might stave off American encroachments better than violence. Additionally, the Red Sticks discovered that most southeastern indigenous leaders cared little for Tecumseh's Confederacy. This lack of allies hindered the spread of a movement in the Southeast, and the Red Sticks soon found themselves in a civil war against other Creeks. Tecumseh thus found little support in the Southeast beyond the Red Sticks, who by 1813 were cut off from the North by Andrew Jackson. Shortly thereafter, Jackson's forces were joined by Lower Creek and Cherokee forces that helped defeat the Red Sticks, culminating in Jackson's victory at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Following their defeat, the Red Sticks were forced to cede an unprecedented 14 million acres of land in the Treaty of Fort Jackson. As historian Adam Rothman argues, the defeat of the Red Sticks allowed the United States to expand west of the Mississippi, guaranteeing the continued existence and profitability of slavery. Many Native leaders refused to join Tecumseh and instead maintained their loyalties to the American Republic. After the failures of Native American unity and loss at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, Tecumseh's Confederation floundered. The War of 1812 between the United States and Britain offered new opportunities for Tecumseh and his followers. With the United States distracted, Tecumseh and his Confederated Army seized several American forts on their own initiative. Eventually, Tecumseh solicited British aid after sustaining heavy losses from American fighters at Fort Wayne and Fort Harrison. Even then, the Confederacy faced an uphill battle, particularly after American naval forces secured control of the Great Lakes in September 1813, forcing British ships and reinforcements to retreat. Yet Tecumseh and his native allies fought on, despite being surrounded by American forces. Tecumseh told the British commander Henry Proctor, "Our lives are in the hands of the Great Spirit. We are determined to defend our lands, and if it is his will, we wish to leave our bones upon them." Soon thereafter, Tecumseh fell on the battlefields of Moraviantown, Ontario in October 1813. His death dealt a severe blow to Native American resistance against the United States. Men like Tecumseh and Pontiac, however, left behind a legacy of Native American unity that was not soon forgotten.